Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I think we're ready to make a start. My name is Caitlin Byrne. I'm the director of the Griffith Asia Institute, and on behalf of Dr. Bryce Wakefield, the National Executive Director of the Australian Institute for International Affairs, and myself, it is a great pleasure to welcome you here this evening to our joint event. Let me begin firstly by respectfully acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we are meeting here this evening. For me here in Brisbane, that's the Turrbal and the Jagera people. For those of you in Canberra, the Ngunnawal people. And of course, there are many more joining us from other lands across the widest reaches of this virtual platform. And in the spirit of reconciliation, I pay my respects to elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. So it's really a delight to be working this evening with our colleagues at the Australian Institute for International Affairs. Our two institutes, though very different, really do share in a common commitment to building understanding at home and in the region about the world that we're in, and in generating informed debate within Australia about the important and strategic developments on our regional and global stages. Tonight is an example of our shared mission in action. And we're really delighted also to have the support of the Japanese Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Embassy of Japan in Canberra, to Australia in Canberra, and the Consulate General of Japan in Brisbane. Their support has been really tremendous in bringing this evening's event to you. And we hope we're bringing what is sure to be a fascinating conversation with one of Japan's leading international relations experts, Professor Akio Takahara, and he will be addressing the theme of the strategic dynamics of the Indo-Pacific in a post-COVID world. Last night, it was quite fascinating to listen to the Secretary of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade here in Australia, Frances Adamson, and she delivered an excellent speech to the National Security College in Canberra, in which she really charted a 30-year picture, the past, the present, and the future of Australia's strategic outlook. At the outset, she noted that over the past decade, we've really seen a profound change in the nature, the scale, and the urgency of the nation's security challenges. And looking across the issues that were then teased out, it's absolutely true. But more importantly, when she arrived at her description of the present and the year 2020 in particular, just how dramatic the uptick in that nature, the scale, the urgency, and the impact of the change that has confronted us has been, from shifting power dynamics to trade wars and leadership transitions, from ever more entrenched inequality, poverty, conflict, and corruption, to the vast and relentless challenge of a changing climate. And of course, the unprecedented and almost inescapable impacts of a global pandemic in the form of COVID-19, which has cast its devastating shadow across families, communities, and nations. Its impacts have been far and forward-reaching, affecting lives and livelihoods, and revealing and accentuating fault lines in our global system. These are impacts that we will feel in the decade ahead. And for the nations of Australia, Japan, and India, and the US, coming to terms with the uncertainties of the present and future has really sharpened the imperative for cooperation. Foreign ministers of the four nations met in Tokyo in October and affirmed the importance of broadening their cooperation together and with others for the realization of a free and open Indo-Pacific. This, of course, was followed up and affirmed more recently by Australian and Japanese Prime Ministers Morrison and Suga, respectively, when they met in Tokyo just last week. So, of course, while each nation brings its own interpretation of the free and open Indo-Pacific, there does seem to be a shared interest in finding opportunities for practical cooperation, while supporting shared interests in maintaining the primacy of rules, a commitment to individual rights, and the importance of international law. Of course, with reference to neighbourhoods closer to home, it seems there's also interest in working closely with the nations of ASEAN while stepping up efforts in the Pacific, particularly to deliver on regional recovery efforts. And of course, it's no secret that much of the strategy around a free and open Indo-Pacific is a response to China's rise and ongoing concerns about China's role in the region. This issue in particular raises questions, conundrums, and points of contestation. And I think to take us deeper into all of this, we're really delighted to welcome our guest speaker, Akio Takahara, Professor of Contemporary Chinese Politics at the Graduate School of Law and Politics and the Graduate School of Public Policy at the University of Tokyo. Professor Takahara currently serves also as a Senior Fellow of the Tokyo Foundation for Policy Research, Senior Adjunct Fellow of the Japan Institute of International Affairs, Distinguished Research Fellow of the Japan Forum on International Relations, and Director of JICA Ogata Sadako Research Institute for Peace and Development. Professor Takahara will deliver some initial remarks for about 20 minutes or so before being joined by AIIA National Executive Director, Dr. Bryce Wakefield, for some further conversation. And I know Bryce will have some questions to ask Professor Takahara first before we open up to all of you for a wider question and answer session. We're really keen to have you participating this evening. You will be able to contribute your questions via the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. And we look forward to what will be a robust and fascinating conversation about the strategic dynamics of our region in this incredibly difficult, challenging and unprecedented time. I wonder then with that, if I can now please invite Professor Takahara to take the floor.
Thank you very much, Dr. Byrne, for the very kind introduction. I'm so happy that although I can't be in Australia in person, which is a big pity, we can still communicate in this fashion rather well. I lived in Melbourne in the late 1960s, if you can believe it, over 50 years ago, and was brought up there for 3.5 years. And I really loved playing Aussie rules and cricket. I was a bowler. I didn't have the chance to get a hat trick, but anyhow, I enjoyed the Australian sports very, very much. Without further ado, because there's a limitation of time, let me go into my presentation, which I shall use these slides to help your understanding. All right, so the title is The Strategic Dynamics of the Indo-Pacific in the Post-COVID World. And of course, at the center of this is China. We cannot avoid this. This is my expertise. So let me start by telling you about Wan Yi's visit to Japan. Last night, he flew from Tokyo to Seoul, where he is now. And this was, of course, a focus of a lot of attention in the region. And when he was asked, Mr. Wan was asked in entering the building of the Japanese MOFA, he said that I came here to enhance cooperation and communication. So quite obviously, he came to win the hearts and minds of the Japanese people. But was he successful? I have some doubts about that because the Japanese are now focused on one particular issue amongst many others, that is the Senkaku Islands question, because many Chinese patrol boats have been coming to the vicinity of the islands, and the Japanese media focus was also here. And Mr. Motegi, after the meeting, said that he explained Japan's position and strongly urged China's positive action. But Mr. Wan sort of countered by saying that we will defend our sovereignty. Japan should avoid actions that complicate the situation in delicate maritime areas. So although the atmosphere was rather cordial, and they also talked a lot about positive things over cooperation, over the COVID, and so on and so forth, and there was an agreement to open a hotline on the maritime and air communication mechanism by the end of the year, which is rather good, but still a lot of negative sentiments remain in the minds of the Japanese people. And I can show you this chart, which explains that the number of Chinese patrol boats coming into the contiguous zones around the Senkakus, which is indicate, oops, excuse me, which is indicated by the blue line here. Since last year, the number of Chinese vessels coming in has hit a record high. So this is one of the biggest issues that we have with China at the moment. And very quickly, let me go through the tension over this question in the past 10 years, because from China's point of view, of course, things look rather differently. They are saying that it's because of the provocation from Japan that the Chinese side could not but respond in the way that they are responding. For example, in 2010, that's already 10 years ago, there was the collision between a Chinese trawler and two Japanese Coast Guard vessels. And according to the Chinese, it was the Japanese side that rammed into the small fishing trawler, and Japan applied domestic law and arrested this captain, and that was very provocative. And 2 years later, in 2012, there was a collusion between the then Tokyo Metropolitan Governor Ishihara, who started to claim that he's going to purchase the islands, the Senkaku Islands, from private owner, private landlord, because the central government was not doing enough to defend the islands. There was a collusion between him and the then Prime Minister, Mr. Noda, who eventually bought the islands instead of Mr. Ishihara. And later in the year, 2012, Mr. Abe came back to his position as Prime Minister. And in his administration, he adopted new defense policies. And all these things indicate that Japan has changed. And Japan has become very assertive. So the Chinese have had to respond in the way that they are responding now. That's the Chinese view. But of course, Japan's views are quite the opposite. And we think that the Chinese have been implementing salami slicing. You know, they've been exerting pressure and increasing the pressure gradually. So things did not start in 2010, but rather immediately after the end of the Cold War, with the territorial sea and the contiguous zone law, the new law that came in 1992, named as part of Chinese territory, the Diaoyudao, which is the Chinese name for the Senkaku Islands for the first time. So we were very much surprised, since the tacit understanding had been that neither side would touch on the issue. But China began to touch on this question, although you may not know that the original draft of this law, which was drafted by the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs, did not have this name, Diaoyudao. But when it was circulated, the draft was circulated, there were oppositions from a lot of different departments, including some from the PLA, and eventually, finally, the word Diaoyudao was included. Anyhow, after that, there were many Chinese research vessels coming in to the Japanese territorial waters. And in the beginning of this century, there was the establishment of the Association for Protecting Diaoyudao in China. Activists landed forcefully on the major island in the Senkaku Islands, and they were arrested. Japanese domestic law was applied then for the first time to arrest them and send them back. Nuclear submarines, one important question was 2006 introduction of a new system in China to regularly patrol the so-called territory in the East China Sea. So the Chinese have been gradually adopting these measures to exert pressure on the scene, and I mean more action, not only in words, but also they've been preparing for real action. And for the first time, the Chinese patrol boats intruded into the Japanese territorial waters in December 2008. And they stepped it up after 2010, the trawler collision incident. And all these this escalation sort of corresponds to the rise in the Chinese defense budget, which is shown in this figure that I took from the Japanese defense white paper. So you can see how quickly the Chinese are building up their defense capabilities, and also their Coast Guard capabilities, which is not shown here, but that's the case. And now the budget for their defense is about 4 times as large as ours. And these are some photos from the incidents that happened in the past 10 years. The trawler collision was actually like this. It was not the Japanese Coast Guard vessels ramming into the trawler, but the other way around. And when the Japanese government did purchase those islands to stabilize the situation, the Chinese took it as provocation. And there were many violent anti-Japanese activities in China. However, since 2014, there has been a gradual improvement in Japan-China relations. I can't explain to you one by one these photographs, but quite significantly in October 2018, then Prime Minister Abe made an official visit to Beijing for the first time in 7 years. And last year in June, the picture in the middle, Xi Jinping came to Japan. He attended the G20 Osaka summit, and Abe-san gave a special dinner for him, a very special treatment when, there were 20 other heads of government were gathering at Osaka. And in December last year, Abe went to China again for the trilateral meeting with the Chinese Prime Minister and the Korean President. And there was another meeting with Xi Jinping. So we were going to have Xi Jinping over to Japan again in April this year, but it didn't come true because of the COVID. And a lot of troubles came up in 2020, including the increase in the Coast Guard vessels, Chinese Coast Guard vessels coming to the Senkakus. I've already talked about that. The spreading of the new coronavirus. The Japanese are very angry about China not apologizing for the pandemic. And things that have been going on in Hong Kong and Xinjiang. All these issues have worsened the image of China amongst the Japanese people. Right? But how should we analyze these developments? I have a very simple analytical framework. There are all sorts of factors that play their roles in Japan-China relations, but I think we can categorize them into 4 major areas. Domestic politics, of course, very important. Economic interests, certainly international environment, and people's perceptions. Let me briefly go through them one by one. Domestic politics, very important since, especially in China, you have to have a very solid power base if you wanted to extend a friendly hand towards the Japanese side, because it could be a very prickly political issue. You don't want to be seen as weak-kneed towards Japan, but Xi Jinping has cleared this condition, right? He has consolidated his power base, so he doesn't have to worry about internal criticisms, even if he adopted a friendly Japan policy. On the Japanese side, it's very interesting because the Japanese public wants the Japanese Prime Minister to stand firm against those actions around the Senkakus, that's for sure. But at the same time, the Japanese public understand by reason that it is important to develop Japan-China relations. That's going to serve the national interest of Japan. So any Japanese Prime Minister must attend to these 2 different desires of the public. And Mr. Abe, I think, has been doing that quite well. And I hope Mr. Suga will follow the same. So these have been positive factors, as it were, in promoting Japan-China relations, together with the international environmental factor, that is the America factor. So there is a traditional pattern in Chinese diplomacy that whenever they have a row with Washington, they turn to Tokyo. And we see that folding out at the moment too. And another area is economics. Economics certainly important. This is to show that this table is to show how important the Chinese market is for Japan. I'm sure it's the same with Australia and many other countries. What about from the Chinese point of view? How does it look? From this table, you can see that the size of, or the percentage of trade with Japan is much smaller than it used to be 20 years ago or 30 years ago. However, still, when we look country by country, USA, of course, remains China's biggest trading partner, but Japan is number 2. And it's not only the quantity of the trade that matters to China, but rather the quality. That is, key components, key parts. A lot of them come from Japan to China, and the investments that the Japanese companies make in China is very important, especially in certain areas which are not doing well economically. They're so important for their tax income, for the employment opportunities, and always there's a lot of Chinese local leaders asking the Japanese companies to make more investments. So economics is another factor, especially when the Chinese economic slowdown is real, is continuing. And despite the fact that, of course, compared to other countries, especially in North America and Europe, China is recovering much more quickly from the COVID damage. However, when we compare the situation of the Chinese economy, with what it was like a year ago or two years back, the damage has been very big. So despite the propaganda that comes out from China, we have to monitor very carefully what's actually going on in the Chinese, especially the local towns and the countryside, because we know roughly what's going on in big cities in China, but we know very little about the reality of the local towns and the countryside. But anyhow, so the economic troubles actually is another positive factor that makes China approach towards Japan. The interesting area is people's perceptions. I think this is also important when we talk about international relations in this part of the world. But you can see in the green line, which indicates the percentage of Chinese people who have a favorable view of Japan, increasing in the past 7-8 years. This year, the latest figure just came out about a week ago. There hasn't been much increase, a very slight decrease, roughly the same as last year. But the contrast is big because on the Japanese side, only 10% of the Japanese people have a favorable view of China. That was shown this year. Why is this the case? Now, we tend to think that the rise in the image of Japan amongst the Chinese people is related to the increase in the number of Chinese people coming over to Japan. So this is a chart that shows that in the past 6 years or five years or so, the number of Chinese visitors to Japan have quadrupled. Of course, this year, 2020, because of the coronavirus, this number is almost zero. And that could explain why there hasn't been an increase, the green line, in the percentage of the Chinese people with a good image of Japan. But on the other hand, why do the Japanese people have an unfavorable image of China? The same survey asks these questions, and every year in recent years, it's the same. The top reason why the Japanese don't have a favorable view of China is because they send the boats and the aircraft to the senkakus. And the second largest reason is because they don't abide by international rules, with the South China Sea issue and so on and so forth. So what are we to do in this kind of a situation? Of course, it is important to have a stable relationship with China. I told you that a great majority of the Japanese think Japan-China relations are important, and we understand that it is for our national interest to have a stable and good relationship with China. I think the first step to do is to rightly acknowledge that there are two aspects in the relationship. One is the resilient aspect of the relationship. If there was no resilience in Japan-China relations, then we could not have recovered in such a short period of time. In 2012, it was at rock bottom. But then in 6 years, we lifted the relationship up to this level. And it indicates the resilience in the relationship. So we should be confident about that. However, the fragile aspect, the fragility is also very real over security, the islands issues, the history issue, and the huge perception gap that exists between the Chinese people and the Japanese people. All these constitute the fragility in the relationship. And I think in order to maintain peace and stabilize the relationship and develop the relationship, we have to mobilize all sorts of things, like, as the realists say, balance of power is needed, so Quad is very good. I think we have to develop a security cooperation, but the liberalists have a point when they say that interdependence helps to maintain peace. RCEP, cooperation over COVID-19, anti-piracy, you name it. We're actually doing these things, and that's good. And the constructivists would say that the sharing of norms, values are very important. So let's try and pursue those things. So overall, I think we need to adopt a two-pronged approach. So on the one hand, we have to compete and win the competition. But on the other hand, we have to seek for cooperation. So it's a very contradictory kind of a situation, but we have to live with this contradiction, and we have to live through this contradiction. And one example is FOIP. In my mind, this contains the competition and cooperation that I was talking about. We all sort of we have all been focusing on the competition side of FOIP, I think, recently, but we should never forget that there is the cooperative side of FOIP, and that's the side that the Japanese government has been emphasizing. We even changed the name. We used to call it the strategy, but then we changed it to a vision. And now we don't even call it a vision. It's just free and open Indo-Pacific, because, ASEAN has its outlook, and many European countries are joining in. So, to be more inclusive, we just call it the free and open Indo-Pacific. And if you go to the homepage of the Japanese Foreign Ministry, you'll find all these points about economic cooperation. And it's the same with the BRI in that sense, because BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative of China's, has both aspects, the strategic aspect and the cooperative aspect. And I believe that they are compatible. The BRI is a concept that I believe is a product of a diplomatic genius on the part of the Chinese Communist Party. It sounds so good, it sounds so attractive, but we should not focus too much on that concept, because in my mind, it's just a constellation. I don't think anybody has seen a constellation. That's why I deliberately typed the word in bright yellow so that it's difficult for you to see. But what's tangible are the stars, right? Up in the air, up in the space. So it's the same. Projects are what's important. Projects are real. They are the stars. And if they are good projects, on condition that the project is a good project, we can cooperate. That's what Mr. Abe said in 2017. And that sort of promoted Japan-China relations, because this concept is a symbol of Xi Jinping's power and authority. That's how I would define the BRI. And FOIP is also another constellation. So there's no problem for two constellations to share a star or two or three. And that's what we should be aiming for. That's one thing that I wanted to say. But the balancing between the two prongs, the two-pronged approach is okay. It sounds good, but how are you going to balance the competition and the cooperation? That's really not easy. So I think the basic point is to acknowledge that China itself is not monolithic. Inside China, the views are divided. On the one side, if I could simplify things a little, there are the hardliners who tend to be more nationalistic, more conservative. They don't want to reform the state-owned enterprises, for example. But on the other hand, there are the moderates who are more internationalist and who are more inclined towards reforming the old economic system that exists in China. But of course, this tug of war between the hardliners and moderates, they continue. And from our point of view, I think it's important to help the moderates within China. And if we only exert pressure on China, that is not going to help the moderates, but rather we are providing ammunition to the hardliners. But anyway, it's not easy to live with this contradiction. In order to do so, we need resolve, wisdom, and resilience, I think. So let me stop here. And I very much welcome your criticisms and questions. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much, Professor Takahara. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Bryce Wakefield. I'm the National Executive Director of the Australian Institute of International Affairs. And I used to live in Japan. I used to teach Japanese politics in Holland too. So I'm very pleased to have this discussion about Japan, China, and their region. Now, for those of you who are with us, if you could just type in your questions via the Q&A. There seems to be something going haywire with the Q&A system. I may not be able to read your name out on air, but if you type a question, I will be able to see it. And if you like a question, there is the upvote option. So if you can just click the thumb if you see a question you like, and it should float to the top and grab my attention. First, though, I want to kick off with a question of my own, and it's related to the perception and information gaps that you talked about. I wonder to what degree are the issues that we have, or the problems that we have between Japan and China, exacerbated by the fact that they don't really understand each other's political systems. So, for example, I think of the business around the Senkakus and Ishihara Shintaro, who was the mayor, sorry, not the mayor, the governor of Tokyo at the time, saying that he was going to purchase those islands. They were owned by a private owner at the time. And then the government came in and gave the private owner a better deal. The government didn't have the power under Japan's democratic system to stop the sale, and just went ahead and purchased the islands on their own accord. Now, I think to some degree that was seen in China as the government solidifying its hold on the islands, when the government was effectively trying to do the Chinese a favor, I guess, in its own words, trying to assuage the situation. I wonder to what degree that was exacerbated by, for example, the fact that China perhaps didn't understand that there was no kind of intensification of sovereignty claims by the government. You know, it was just a transfer of power. The government wasn't saying anything about sovereignty. Of course, they were saying that Japan always had sovereignty over the islands. Is it a lack of understanding about political systems that drives the tension between the two countries?
That's part of the reason, I should think. And some people who know the difference in the Chinese Communist Party could make use of that. You know, on the Senkakus, you're quite right. In China, there's no distinction between the central government and the local government. They're all part of the state. Whereas in Japan, you know, the local governments are not part of the state. They are local autonomous entities, and the governors are elected directly by the people, which is completely different from the system that China has. But not only that, I remember a conversation I had with the students from Peking University quite soon after the incident. And they were so surprised to hear from me that those islands used to be owned by a private landlord. Is that possible in Japan? That was the reaction that they made. So, you know, there are all sorts of systemic differences that cause misunderstanding. So the word nationalization, from their point of view, was not the purchasing of the islands by the state from a private landlord, but rather it was no man's land, and Japan went and made the islands their own. And that's the image that they got because of the systemic differences.
All right, we have a question now from a very esteemed scholar of Japanese politics, Purnendra, and international relations, Purnendra Jain, who is also the vice president of our South Australia branch. Hi, Purnendra, how are you? He asks, there seems to be a pattern in Japan's China relations, an escalation in tensions followed by some de-escalation through top leaders' visits, etc. Will the relationship remain like this for a long time? The visit of Premier Wang does not seem to have diffused tensions between the two, and PM Suga, as I understand, did not invite Xi to visit Japan, a visit that was postponed, cancelled earlier this year, says Penandra.
Yes, because of the political system, it's very important to have direct contact between the top leaders. In the ideal case, it's Xi Jinping himself, but if not the number two, the prime minister. And therefore, in order to develop the relationship, to stabilize and develop the relationship, Xi Jinping's visit to Japan would be very helpful, very important. But at the same time, in order to make the visit successful, we have to improve the atmosphere in the two societies. It's all right on the Chinese side, apparently, but in Japan, there's so much anti-Chinese sentiments because of the reasons that I told you. We would like to tell the Chinese side that if you wanted to make Xi Jinping's visit come true and make it a success, then you have to stop sending those patrol boats to the Senkakus. Otherwise, it's going to be very difficult now to improve the atmosphere in Japan.
Very good. Okay, our next question is from an anonymous attendee. They asked, to what degree is there potential for cooperation between Japan and China to defeat the COVID-19 pandemic? Has there been any cooperation?
Yes, I believe it was already in May when the ministers in charge of health got together, Japan, China, and Korea, and started discussing how we can cooperate. I am not aware of the details of the cooperation, but these kind of frameworks have always been active amongst the three nations, in addition to the bilateral ones that we have. So there should be a lot of communication, but I'm sorry, but I'm not aware of the details.
Okay, thank you very much. Our next question is from Christopher Skinner, who is a member of our New South Wales branch. He says that the Free and Open Indo-Pacific, FOIP, sounds like a pale copy of the BRI. Surely the real issue is to provide better vision for the global community in which BRI is a positive contribution, but not the main game. In other words, is not the BRI only a part of what we should advocate for a free and open world in which sovereignty of territorial and demographic groupings is, I guess, of great importance?
Sorry, the question is?
Is not the BRI only a part of what we should advocate for a free and open world in which sovereignty of territorial and demographic groupings is of great importance?
Well, the BRI, in my understanding, there isn't a very systematic formulation of a strategy, as it were. What it is basically is a collection of projects. There's a lot of talk about connectivity, linking up, and having common custom systems, or green BRI, digital BRI. All sorts of words have been said, but we haven't seen any comprehensive and detailed design of the formation of a certain regional framework. That's not what it is. What it is that there have been a lot of projects, and there have been new ones added on under the name of BRI, but they are very, how should I say, separate. And the Chinese themselves, for example, cannot define the BRI. When we ask what the definition of the BRI is, there is no clear answer. And what you find in the official documents, it's only this kind of a definition. Under BRI, this is done, that is done. But what is the BRI? There's no clear definition, and there's no contour of the concept. So, we shouldn't pay too much attention to the concept, but rather let's focus on each project. It's just like reform and opening. What is reform and opening is not very clear. If you think that it is a set of reform policies, certainly reform and opening did not begin in 1978. But the Chinese want to say reform and opening started in 1978 because reform and opening is a symbol of Deng Xiaoping's authority and power. So, the CCP is very good at creating these concepts. But what's important for the Chinese people, what's important for us, the individual policies or individual projects, and we shouldn't overestimate the overall concept.
I suppose then you might say the same thing about the free and open Indo-Pacific.
Sure. Free and open Indo-Pacific is another constellation.
Yeah.
And free and open Indo-Pacific needs more substantiation, as it were. It's a growing concept. It's a growing constellation. So we need more symbolic stars, projects to show to the people what we are aiming for. Now it's rather murky.
Okay, very good. Right, we've got a question from Prakash Merchandani, and that person is a director or council member of AIIA Victoria, and they ask about India. So to what extent will the increased naval cooperation of India with the Quad affect the equation of China's behavior, both in the South China Sea, I guess, and on the border with India?
That we have to see how things will fold out in the Indian Ocean, how the Chinese will respond to further cooperation, especially amongst the four nations. And I'm pretty sure the Chinese are thinking very hard how to respond to the recent developments by the Quad nations. So we shall see how things will fold out in the coming years.
Okay, very good. Now, I think I'll follow that one up with one of my own. The Quad, of course, is not just India, Japan, and the United States, but Australia as well. And in the past week or so, we've had some very big news about the agreement in principle that Japan and Australia will be signing a reciprocal access agreement. Now, some of the newspapers here have been referring to that as a defense pact. I've seen at least one that has said it's a defense treaty, which is not quite true. Now, I haven't been monitoring the Japanese press closely, but I do know that the name for the agreement is quite modest. In Japan, it's called just a facilitation agreement, Enkatsu Kyote. I wonder if you could give us some sort of impression as to how the agreement in principle of the reciprocal access agreement is being taken in Japan. Is it something that the Japanese are paying a lot of attention to?
I don't really think so. We don't, generally speaking, the Japanese don't understand military affairs at all. So what does this mean to us in reality? I don't think people sort of get the idea immediately. And because of these constitutional restrictions and so on and so forth, I don't think things will dramatically or drastically change because of these commitments made. So whenever there's going to be a concrete incident, that's different. And then people will see that this new agreement is working in this way or the other. But without those things, I think it will take a lot of time for the Japanese to see what it really means. And I do think that all these things to reinforce the security cooperation between Japan and Australia is the direction in which we are moving, but it's not going to sort of jump levels. It will go one by one, bit by bit. And it's only the very, very beginning of that development at this stage.
Very good. Right, now we've got a question here from one Yi Wang at Waseda University, and they ask, that they seem to be suggesting that Beijing's approach to Japan is somewhat contradictory. So on the one hand, Beijing wants to improve its ties with Japan. Since 2018, we have, of course, seen mutual visits between Japan and China. But on the other hand, we do have the intrusion into the waters of the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands. Why does China take this fundamentally contradictory policy?
Yes, so I think China is playing the same game, as it were. They are adopting a two-pronged approach towards Japan. So from their point of view, the competition around the Senkakus is something that they have to win. But we are telling them that you cannot chase two rabbits at the same time. You know, if you really want a good relationship with Japan, you cannot send boats to the Senkakus. That's what we are trying to tell the Chinese side. But whether Xi Jinping will understand this or not is another question, because the general idea is salami slicing, as I said, to exert pressure bit by bit. And, you know, it's the Sun Tzu art of war. They are trying to win without fighting. They are trying to increase the pressure so that eventually the other side will give in. That's the strategy they adopt, not only towards Japan, but towards other countries in the neighborhood. But that's not going to work. And that's the message we are trying to convey to the Chinese side.
Okay, very good. We've got a question here from Jane Munro. Thank you, Jane. To what extent is the US a negative influence in Sino-Japanese relations today? So according to Jane, in Australia, we seem to experience great influence from the USA with respect to our relations with China. How does Japan keep the US at bay? Australian negative attitudes to China seem now to be similar to Japanese negative attitudes to China, but with respect to different specific issues.
So when US-China relations deteriorate, it could work in two different ways. One is, from the Chinese point of view, they would like to improve relations with Japan to balance the deteriorating relations with the US. And that's what we're seeing now. But at the same time, if the US tries to involve the Japanese in, for example, imposing sanctions on China, you know, don't export these products to China, don't invest in this area in China. If those requests start coming, you know, it's already started, but then directly that's going to hit the economic interests of many Japanese firms. So, you know, these two different things go in different directions. And we were very worried that if the Trump administration was to continue, then they would, it's good in a way, because the Chinese will want us more. But on the other hand, it's bad since more sanctions involving other nations could have come. So that is the situation.
We have a question here from an anonymous attendee. It's, if I can just rephrase it a little bit, perhaps, there is a criticism in the West that we've been somewhat naive towards China, that we have held its hand and we've encouraged it to integrate itself into, I guess, the rules-based international order, and that view is now seen as somewhat naive given the behavior of China. So in your presentation, you talked about hardliners and moderates. How can we, asks the anonymous attendee, explore the balanced approach and give moderates enough ammunition? I mean, didn't we already try to do it, and didn't that result in the problems that we're having now?
So the key question is whether China will change or not, right? And now this new thinking, which has become a mainstream, perhaps, that China will not change. China hasn't changed, and China will not change, and therefore we need to adopt a very tough approach towards China. I don't agree with that because, as a China expert, when I compare China today and what China was 40 years ago, China has changed greatly, and the Chinese people have changed greatly. And I'm pretty sure that in 30 years, 30 years from now, 40 years from now, China will be a completely different place. And the Chinese will be very different in many ways from what the Chinese are now. And even, without any engagement, the Chinese themselves are changing. But my idea is that we adopt this two-pronged approach and maintain peace, try to reap the benefits out of cooperation with China, and hold on to this peace for, let's say, 20 years. Around then, China should change. So we should have a long-term perspective. Don't expect China to change in a few years. It takes time for China to change completely, but every day China is changing. Yes, with Xi Jinping, it's going backwards. Xi Jinping himself is claiming that no, I'm not going history backwards, but we all know that he is. The Chinese people know that he is, and perhaps he himself knows that he is. But anyway, we have to persevere. We have to put up with this very difficult period, because it's a contradiction, as I was saying, if I may repeat, and it's not easy psychologically for us, to do these contradictory things at the same time. But we have to have the resilience and the wisdom to live through this contradiction and wait for China to change and help the Chinese change wherever and whenever we can.
Okay, very good. So we have a question now about Taiwan again from Christopher Skinner. Taiwan is potentially an irritant in the relationship. How does Japan view China's claim that Taiwan is the integral territory of China, and what are they doing about it?
So once again, under Xi Jinping, China is exerting more pressure on Taiwan. It's another slicing. They started to fly over the middle line more often than before. So it's the same scene as we see in the East China Sea and the South China Sea. So I suppose, from the Taiwanese point of view, they will have to enhance their security cooperation, especially with the United States. There has been a lot of talk about the possibility of Xi Jinping actually moving on, taking action towards the Taiwanese. But I can't see that possibility very high at the moment, because there are other areas of conflict, like in India, we have seen some action, and the Vietnamese are always very concerned. And if I was a Chinese leader, of course, I shall choose an easy place to act if I really was pressured to act, rather than going into a direct conflict with the United States.
All right. This may be our last question, but I do want to leave it to the youth as such. We have a student from Griffith who studies international business and wants to become an international leader. And Jordan Leadbetter, is asking how can he, that is graduates or the younger generation, contribute effectively to assisting in developing collaborative relationships between the Asia-Pacific nations, and helping to solve issues like historical disputes and issues surrounding the South China Sea. What's the best thing a young person can do to alleviate the tensions?
Great. I would advocate what I call originalism. That is, What I mean is, whenever you come across any information, especially I think the media is a very important source of information when it comes to understanding foreign countries or international relations, do check the original document or the statement, because at times what's being reported, the nuance could be different, not only in the media, but also even the experts' remarks, like mine, could have a different nuance from what the original document or the statement had. So do go to the original documents and check for yourself what was actually written or what was actually said, and make that a habit and try to understand how things look from the other side. So in order to have a balanced view of the whole situation, you have to look not only into the sources on your side in your country, but also try to understand how things look from the other side. On the history issue too, there's a lot of misunderstandings about the history issue. I can go on and on and on with examples after examples, but let me stop here and repeat just once again, go to the originals.
Okay, very good. There is one more question. I'll summarize it quickly. It's quite a long one as written, but it's asking about Asian values, essentially, right? And you know, it's essentially making the point that in many ways Japan and China can or may understand each other through those values. Now, a couple of decades ago, Asian values were a big point of discussion. I remember actually Shintaro Ishihara and Mahathir wrote a book about it, didn't they? But is there any? I don't mean to make light of it, but is there any space here for the two countries understanding each other through a shared history or culture?
Absolutely. I don't deny that. We should make use of everything, and I didn't have time to elaborate, but cultural affinity is a very important part of the resilience in Japan-China relations. For instance, the Japanese love Chinese classics. We all know about the Romance of the Three Kingdoms and what have you. And the Chinese side, especially the youngsters, seem to like Japanese animation very, very much. So, you know, all these cultural ties that we have, we should treasure and make it a part of the basis on which we can build our common future.
Okay, very good. That's about all we have time for. I want to thank Griffith University, who's been partnering up with us, the Embassy of Japan that has helped us to arrange this talk, and also the Consul General, the Japanese Consul General of Brisbane. And of course, I would like to thank our speaker, Professor Takahara Akio. And I want to turn things over to Caitlin to say goodbye.
Thank you, Bryce.
Thank you, Bryce. And thank you, Professor Takahara. Just a fabulous, you know, you've covered enormous ground in a very short space of time. Thank you for your generous insights and expertise, particularly providing a Japanese perspective into how we might understand China and China's role and place in the Indo-Pacific. It's been a real pleasure to listen to you. I'll just add my thanks, Bryce, to you, to the AIIA, to the Embassy of Japan in Canberra, the Consulate General of Japan here in Brisbane, and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Tokyo, for facilitating this evening's lecture with us and supporting us to do that. Thank you very much.